The champagne flutes shattered against the marble floor of the Hillside Manor. Ballroom as 300 wedding guests watched in stunned silence. My bride Jessica stood frozen at the altar, her designer dress suddenly feeling like a costume. In the most expensive lie of her life, in my hand I held the phone displaying photos that would destroy everything she'd built. Pictures of her tangled in bedsheets with David Park just hours before our ceremony. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming, including myself, until I lived through this nightmare twice. As Jessica's world crumbled around her, her sister Emma stepped forward from the crowd, took my hand, and whispered the words that changed everything. "I've been waiting for you to see the truth." 6 months earlier, I thought I was the luckiest man alive. Today, I'm about to marry the woman I was always meant to be with. 6 months before, what should have been the happiest day of my life, I was living in what I thought was a perfect relationship with Jessica Rodriguez. We had everything figured out: a beautiful home in Cedar Park, successful careers, and a wedding planned at Austin's most exclusive venue. Jessica ran her own marketing firm, and I was pulling in 6 figures as a lead software engineer at a growing tech startup. On paper, we were the power couple that everyone envied. Jessica had this way of making everything seem effortless. She'd wake up at 5:30 every morning, already dressed in her perfectly coordinated workout gear, heading to her Pilates class before most people even thought about coffee. By the time I stumbled into the kitchen, she'd already have my protein smoothie ready and be reviewing client presentations on her tablet. Her hair was always immaculate, her makeup flawless, and she moved through our shared life like she was choreographing a dance that I was lucky to be part of. Our relationship had started 3 years earlier at a University of Texas alumni hiking event at Cedar Park. I was there reluctantly, dragged along by my best friend Tyler, who insisted I needed to get out more after my last relationship ended badly. Jessica appeared like something out of a magazine advertisement for outdoor gear, leading a group discussion about sustainable trail maintenance, while somehow making environmental conservation sound like the sexiest topic in the world. When she approached me afterward and suggested we grab coffee, I felt like I'd won some kind of lottery I hadn't even known I'd entered. The courtship was a whirlwind of perfectly planned dates, from sunrise hot air balloon rides over the hill, country to intimate dinners at restaurants I couldn't afford, but she insisted on splitting the bill for. Jessica had this incredible ability to make me feel like I was exactly where I belonged, even when I suspected I was probably punching above my weight class. She introduced me to her family with genuine pride, and her parents, Carlos and Maria, welcomed me like I was already part of the Rodriguez clan. Her younger sister Emma was finishing her art degree at UT then, and while she was always friendly during family gatherings, she seemed to keep a careful distance from Jessica's romantic life. The proposal happened exactly 18 months into our relationship, at the same spot where we'd first met. Jessica cried the perfect amount, enough to seem genuinely moved, but not so much that her makeup ran. She said yes before I'd even finished asking the question, and within hours, she'd already started a shared Pinterest board for wedding planning. Looking back now, I realize how quickly she took control of every detail. From the venue selection to the guest list, always with reasonable explanations that made me feel like an equal partner. Even as I gradually realized I was mainly responsible for nodding and writing checks, the wedding planning consumed the next 1.5 years of our lives. Jessica threw herself into it with the same professional intensity she brought to her marketing campaigns. She had spreadsheets for everything: catering timelines, seating, arrangements organized by complex social dynamics I'd never considered, vendor contact information with backup options for every service. She scheduled our engagement photos, booked our honeymoon to Costa Rica, and somehow managed to coordinate schedules with both families for regular planning. Meetings that felt more like boardroom presentations than casual family discussions. During this time, Jessica's business was exploding. Rodriguez and Associates had landed several major clients, including a real estate development company based out of Houston. She started traveling more frequently, sometimes staying overnight, in San Antonio or Dallas for client meetings and industry conferences. She'd send me photos from hotel lobbies and conference rooms, always apologizing for the distance, but explaining how these opportunities were setting us up for an incredible future together. The extra income from these new contracts allowed us to upgrade our wedding plans from elegant to extravagant, and Jessica made sure. I understood how her sacrifice of time away from home was really an investment in our shared dreams. I trusted her completely. Why wouldn't I? Jessica had never given me a reason to doubt her faithfulness, and she seemed genuinely excited about our upcoming marriage. She'd send me links to articles about successful married couples, talk about our future children with specific details, about the schools we'd send them to, make comments about growing old together that felt both romantic and comfortingly practical. When she started working later hours and traveling more frequently, it felt like natural career progression for someone as ambitious and talented as she was. The first crack in my perfect world appeared on a Tuesday evening in January. For months before our wedding date, Jessica was supposed to be in Dallas for a 3-day marketing conference, but she'd forgotten her phone charger and asked me to overnight it to her hotel. When I went to pack it, I noticed she'd left her laptop open on the kitchen counter, which was unusual since she normally guarded that device like it contained state secrets. The screen showed her email inbox, and the most recent message had a subject line that made my stomach drop. "Can't wait to see you again tonight, D." I stared at that email for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Part of my brain immediately started generating innocent explanations. Maybe it was from a client named Deborah or Daniel. Maybe it was about a business dinner. Maybe it was completely professional correspondence that just happened to sound personal out of context. But something deeper in my gut was screaming that this was exactly what it looked like, and I'd been willfully ignoring signs for months. Instead of opening the email, which would have been a clear violation of Jessica's privacy, I closed the laptop and tried to forget what I'd seen. I shipped her charger overnight as requested and waited for her to come home when she returned. Thursday evening, she was glowing with excitement about new business opportunities and potential partnerships that could take her company to the next level. She brought me a gift from Dalasa, vintage concert poster from a band. We'd seen together on our second date and spent the evening cuddled against me on the couch, talking about how much she'd missed sleeping next to me. For 2 weeks, I convinced myself that the email had been innocent and my suspicions were just pre-wedding anxiety. Jessica seemed more affectionate than usual, more present during our conversations, more enthusiastic about our wedding plans. She surprised me with tickets to see my favorite comedian at the Paramount Theater, planned a weekend getaway to our favorite bed and breakfast in Fredericksburg, and even suggested we start trying to get pregnant during our honeymoon. Everything felt perfect again, and I was relieved that my paranoid thoughts had been nothing more than cold feet. But then Jessica's travel schedule intensified even further. She was suddenly needed in Houston twice a month, staying overnight for meetings that couldn't be conducted remotely. She started mentioning David Park more frequently. He was the head of the real estate development company that had become her biggest client, and apparently he was so impressed with her work that he was considering making Rodriguez and Associates his exclusive marketing partner for all future projects. This partnership could triple her company's revenue, she explained, but it required a lot of face-to-face relationship building and creative collaboration. The way Jessica talked about David made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't articulate. She described him as brilliant and visionary, someone who really understood her creative process and appreciated her strategic thinking. She mentioned how refreshing it was to work with a client who trusted her instincts completely, who gave her the creative freedom to develop campaigns that were genuinely innovative rather than just safe and conventional.
When I asked what David
was like personally, Jessica would get this distant look in her eyes and describe him as sophisticated, well-traveled, and intellectually curious in ways that reminded me she'd once said similar things about me, but with less enthusiasm. The breaking point came on a Friday in February. Jessica was supposed to be in Houston for the weekend, working on a major presentation for David's company. I'd planned to spend Saturday working on wedding preparation tasks, specifically addressing invitations and confirming catering details. Around noon, I realized I needed Jessica's input on the vegetarian menu options, so I called her phone. It went straight to voicemail, which wasn't unusual since she often turned it off during important meetings. I tried again an hour later with the same result. By evening, I was genuinely worried. Jessica always checked in during business trips, usually sending me photos of her dinner or texting goodnight messages before bed. When Saturday passed without any communication, I started imagining worst-case scenarios. What if she'd been in an accident? What if there was some kind of emergency, and she couldn't reach her phone? By Sunday morning, my anxiety had reached the point where I was ready to drive to Houston and check on her myself. That's when Jessica finally called, sounding breathless and apologetic. She explained that her phone had died and she'd forgotten to pack her charger, and spent the weekend in intensive strategy sessions that ran so late she'd basically been sleeping at the office. She'd just gotten home and found my worried messages, and she felt terrible for causing me to panic. She promised to buy a backup charger and be more careful about communication during future business trips. Her explanation was perfectly reasonable, but something about her voice sounded different. She seemed nervous in a way that didn't match someone who'd just had a successful business weekend. When she talked about the work she'd accomplished, her descriptions were vague and generic. Rather than the detailed, enthusiastic reports she usually gave about her projects, when I asked specific questions about the presentation she'd been working on, she changed the subject to our wedding plans and started talking about flower arrangements with forced enthusiasm that felt like a performance. That Sunday night, as Jessica slept beside me after being away for 3 days. I lay awake staring at the ceiling and acknowledging what I had been trying not to think for weeks. My fiancé was having an affair with David Park, and our perfect relationship was built on lies that were becoming harder for her to maintain. The woman I was planning to marry in 3 months was living a double life, and I had no idea how long it had been going on or how deep her deception ran. The question that kept me awake until dawn wasn't whether Jessica was cheating. I was already certain she was. The question was what I was going to do about it, and whether I had the courage to face the truth that was about to destroy everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the woman I'd promised to spend my life with. The Monday morning after my sleepless night of realization, I sat in my office cubicle staring at lines of code that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics. My mind was completely consumed with thoughts of Jessica and David Park, spinning scenarios and trying to piece together a timeline of when their relationship had shifted from professional to personal. Every interaction I'd had with Jessica over the past 6 months suddenly took on new meaning, and I found myself questioning memories I'd previously cherished. Tyler noticed my distraction during our usual coffee break and pulled me aside to ask if I was having second thoughts about the wedding. The irony of his question wasn't lost on me, but I couldn't bring myself to voice my suspicions out loud. Instead, I made vague comments about pre-wedding stress and let him assume I was just dealing with typical groom anxiety.
Tyler had always
Liked Jessica, describing her as the perfect match for my analytical personality. And I wasn't ready to shatter his positive impression based on what were still technically just suspicions. That evening, Jessica returned from work earlier than usual, carrying takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant and announcing that she'd cleared her schedule to spend quality time with me. She seemed determined to make up for her weekend absence, asking detailed questions about my work projects and listening with the kind of focused attention that had originally made me fall in love with her. We spent the evening reviewing wedding vendor contracts and discussing honeymoon activities. And for a few hours, I almost convinced myself that my paranoid thoughts had been completely unfounded. But when Jessica excused herself to take a shower, I noticed she'd left her phone face down on the coffee table, which was unusual since she normally kept it within arm's reach at all times. The temptation to look was overwhelming, but I'd never violated her privacy before, and I wasn't sure I was ready to cross that line. Instead, I found myself studying her behavior with the kind of analytical attention I usually reserve for debugging complex software problems. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to Jessica's patterns and inconsistencies. She'd always been meticulous about her appearance, but lately she was spending extra time on her makeup and hair, even for routine errands. She'd started wearing perfume to the grocery store and choosing outfits for mundane activities with the care most people reserved for important social events. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I complimented her on looking particularly beautiful, she'd get flustered in a way that seemed more guilty than pleased. Her phone habits had changed too. Jessica used to leave her device charging on the nightstand while we watched television together. But now she kept it in her lap or carried it with her to the bathroom. She'd started receiving text messages at odd hours. And while she'd always been responsive to work communications, she now seemed to react to certain notifications with an urgency that felt personal rather than professional. When I asked casual questions about who was texting her so late, she'd mention client emergencies or industry contacts in different time zones, but her explanations always seemed rehearsed. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday evening when Jessica announced she needed to make an emergency trip to San Antonio for a client crisis that couldn't wait until morning. She seemed genuinely stressed about the situation, apologizing profusely for the short notice and promising to make it up to me when she returned. She packed quickly, kissing me goodbye with what felt like genuine affection, and assured me she'd be back by Friday afternoon at the latest. After Jessica left, I spent 2 hours pacing around our house, trying to talk myself out of what I was considering. Going through her belongings would be a fundamental violation of trust. And if I was wrong about my suspicions, it would poison our relationship in ways that might be impossible to repair. But if I was right, then the trust had already been broken. And I needed to know the truth before walking down the aisle and legally binding myself to someone who was deceiving me. I started with Jessica's home office, which she'd always kept meticulously organized. Her filing system was color-coded and alphabetized, with separate folders for each client and project. I found extensive documentation for her work with David Park's company, including contracts, correspondence, and creative briefs that all appeared completely professional. The paperwork supported Jessica's claims about the scope and importance of their business relationship. And for a moment I felt ashamed of my suspicions. But then I noticed something that made my stomach clench. Jessica had 2 separate folders. For David Park's company, one labeled with the official business name, and another simply marked DP Projects in her handwriting. The official folder contained all the documents I'd already reviewed, but the second folder held printed emails and handwritten notes that told a completely different story. The emails started innocuously enough, with David complimenting Jessica's creative vision and suggesting they schedule additional brainstorming sessions to develop her ideas further, but the tone gradually shifted from professional admiration to personal interest. With David making comments about Jessica's intelligence and beauty that crossed clear professional boundaries, Jessica's responses were initially polite but distant, maintaining professional language while subtly redirecting conversations back to business topics. The shift happened around Thanksgiving, based on the email timestamps. David had invited Jessica to a gallery opening in Houston, describing it as a networking opportunity where she could meet potential clients in the arts and culture sector. Jessica's response indicated she'd attended the event, and the following emails showed a dramatic change in their dynamic. David's messages became more intimate, referencing inside jokes and shared experiences that suggested they'd spent significant time together outside of business meetings. Jessica's replies transformed to becoming warmer and more personal. Started using casual language and emoticons, sharing details about her personal life, and asking David about his interests and background. By December, their correspondence read like 2 people in the early stages of a romantic relationship, full of flirtation and anticipation for their next meeting. The most damaging evidence was a printed email from just 2 weeks earlier, where David wrote about how much he missed Jessica's presence in his hotel room and couldn't wait to hold her again. Jessica's response was equally intimate, expressing how difficult it was to maintain her normal routine at home when all she could think about was being with him. She wrote about feeling torn between her obligations and her desires, and mentioned that she was counting down the days until her next business trip to Houston. I sat on the floor of Jessica's office, surrounded by evidence of her betrayal, feeling like my entire world had shifted on its axis. The woman I'd been planning to marry, the person I'd trusted with my deepest secrets and my financial future, had been living a complete double life for months. Every business trip, every late night at the office, every apologetic phone call, About work emergencies had been carefully constructed lies designed to hide her affair. The practical part of my brain immediately started calculating the implications. Our wedding was less than 3 months away, with deposits paid to vendors, and invitations already sent to 300 guests. Both sets of parents had contributed significantly to the wedding budget, and Jessica's extended family had already booked flights from out of state. The financial cost of canceling everything would be substantial, but that seemed insignificant compared to the emotional devastation of discovering that my relationship was built entirely on deception. But underneath the shock and hurt, I felt something else growing, a cold, analytical anger that reminded me of how I approached complex programming challenges. Jessica had created an elaborate system of lies, and like any system, it had vulnerabilities that could be exploited. She'd been so confident in her ability to manage her double life that she'd kept detailed records of her deception, never imagining that I might discover them. I spent the rest of that evening photographing every piece of evidence with my phone, creating a comprehensive archive of Jessica's affair. The emails revealed specific dates, locations, and details about her relationship with David that painted a clear picture of systematic betrayal. She hadn't just cheated once in a moment of weakness. She'd been conducting a full romantic relationship with another man while simultaneously planning our wedding and discussing our future children. When I finally went to bed around 3 in the morning, I'd made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I wasn't going to confront Jessica immediately or cancel the wedding in a dramatic explosion of hurt feelings. Instead, I was going to investigate further, gathering enough evidence to understand the full scope of her deception before deciding how to respond. If Jessica wanted to play games with truth and lies, she was about to discover that I was much better at strategic thinking than she'd given me credit for. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to a coffee shop across town where I was unlikely to run into anyone we knew. I needed time to process what I'd learned and develop a plan for moving forward. As I sat with my laptop in a corner booth, I started researching David Park's background in business operations, looking for additional information that might help me understand his relationship with Jessica. What I discovered was both illuminating and infuriating. David Park wasn't just successful, he was wealthy, sophisticated, and had a reputation as someone who enjoyed the finer things in life. His social media profiles showed him at exclusive restaurants, luxury resorts, and cultural events that far exceeded anything I could afford on my software engineer salary. He was everything I wasn't: older, more established, and comfortable in social situations that would intimidate me. But David also had a history that Jessica apparently didn't know about. A deeper dive into business publications and court records revealed that he'd been married twice before, with both marriages ending in messy divorces where his ex-wives accused him of infidelity and emotional manipulation. He had a pattern of pursuing successful, attractive women who could enhance his social status, then discarding them when the novelty wore off or when his interest shifted to someone new. As I read about David's romantic history, I realized that Jessica wasn't his first affair with a business associate, and she probably wouldn't be his last. The emails I'd found suggested she believed their relationship was leading toward something permanent. But David's track record indicated that he viewed married women as particularly appealing precisely because they couldn't make serious demands on his time or commitment. Jessica was being played by an expert, and she was so intoxicated by the attention and luxury he provided that she was willing to risk everything we'd built together. The realization filled me with a complex mixture of anger at her betrayal and pity for her naivety. She thought she was having a sophisticated affair with a successful man who appreciated her in ways I couldn't. But she was actually just the latest in a long line of women who'd fallen for David Park's practiced seduction routine. By the time Jessica returned from her supposed emergency business trip that Friday, I developed a comprehensive understanding of her affair and formulated the beginning of what would become my response strategy. She walked through our front door glowing with happiness and carrying expensive chocolates. She claimed a grateful client had given her, completely unaware that I now knew exactly where she'd spent the last 2 days and with whom. As Jessica kissed me hello and launched into a detailed story about her successful crisis management, I smiled and nodded and asked supportive questions while internally marveling at her commitment to the deception. She was an even better actress than I'd realized, capable of looking me directly in the eyes while spinning elaborate lies about her activities. But now that I understood her game, I could see through every performance. I was ready to start playing by my own rules. The morning of our wedding dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of perfect Texas spring weather that Jessica had specifically hoped for when we'd chosen the date. I woke up at 5:30, not from nerves about getting married, but because I'd barely slept for the past week. Everything was finally in place for what would either be the most satisfying moment of my life or the most spectacular public humiliation in Austin wedding history. Over the past month, I'd been living a double life that rivaled Jessica's own deception. While she continued her affair with David Park, believing she'd successfully hidden it from me, I'd been methodically gathering evidence and planning a revelation that would expose not just her betrayal, but the intricate web of lies she'd constructed around our entire relationship. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd become exactly the kind of strategic deceiver I'd once believed I could never be. The breakthrough that made everything possible had come 3 weeks earlier. During one of Jessica's supposed overnight business trips to Dallas, I'd followed her, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. I'd watched her meet David at the Four Seasons Hotel downtown. They'd embraced in the lobby like longtime lovers, and when they'd disappeared into the elevator together, I'd felt the last vestiges of hope for our relationship finally die. But instead of feeling devastated, I'd experienced something unexpected, a cold, calculating clarity that reminded me why I'd been successful in the tech industry. Jessica had underestimated my intelligence and resourcefulness, assuming that my quiet, analytical nature meant I was passive and easily manipulated. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been about the man she'd agreed to marry. The real revelation had come not from following Jessica, but from a conversation I'd had with her sister Emma the week before our wedding. Emma had been helping with last-minute wedding preparations, and I'd noticed she seemed unusually subdued whenever Jessica was around. During a quiet moment while we were arranging wedding favors at the venue, Emma had looked at me with an expression of such genuine sadness that I'd finally asked if something was bothering her. What Emma told me changed everything I thought. I knew about the Rodriguez family dynamics and Jessica's character. Emma had known about the affair for months, having accidentally discovered David's existence when she'd borrowed Jessica's laptop to work on the wedding slideshow and found intimate messages. Emma had confronted Jessica about the betrayal, begging her to end the affair or call off the wedding. But Jessica had dismissed her concerns and threatened to cut Emma out of her life if she interfered. Emma's revelation explained so much about the family tensions I'd noticed, but hadn't understood. Carlos and Maria Rodriguez had been increasingly cold toward Jessica in recent months, and I'd assumed it was normal parental stress about wedding expenses and logistics. But Emma explained that their parents suspected something was wrong, even if they didn't know the specific details of Jessica's deception. The conversation with Emma had started as her attempt to warn me about Jessica's infidelity, but it had evolved into something much more profound. As we talked through the night about Jessica's patterns of selfishness and manipulation, Emma had revealed her own feelings she'd been hiding for years out of loyalty to her sister. Emma had always been attracted to my kindness and integrity, qualities that Jessica took for granted but that Emma valued deeply. Emma's confession that she'd harbored romantic feelings for me since we'd first met at that family barbecue 3 years earlier should have complicated everything. Instead, it provided the missing piece of a plan that had been forming in my subconscious for weeks. Jessica had chosen to humiliate me through deception and betrayal, conducting her affair while wearing my engagement ring and planning our wedding. If she wanted to play games with family loyalty and romantic manipulation, I was prepared to beat her at her own game. The plan Emma and I developed was audacious in its simplicity. We would let Jessica proceed with the wedding ceremony, allowing her to stand at the altar and make promises she had no intention of keeping. In front of all the people she'd been lying to for months, then, during the exchange of vows, I would reveal the truth about her affair in a way that would make her deception impossible to deny or minimize. Emma's role in the plan was crucial. As Jessica's maid of honor, she had access to information and opportunities that I couldn't obtain on my own. More importantly, Emma's presence would provide a powerful visual contrast when the truth came out. Where Jessica was polished and calculating, Emma was genuine and vulnerable. Where Jessica had chosen deception and betrayal, Emma had chosen honesty and courage, even at the cost of her relationship with her sister. The evidence we'd compiled was comprehensive and damaging. I had photographs of Jessica and David together at various hotels and restaurants, screenshots of their intimate text messages, and even a recording of a phone conversation where Jessica had told David she was only going through with the wedding to maintain her social image until she could figure out how to leave me without damaging her business reputation. But the most devastating piece of evidence was something Emma had discovered while helping Jessica pack for her final pre-wedding business trip. Hidden in Jessica's suitcase, underneath her professional clothes, Emma had found lingerie she'd never seen before, expensive, seductive pieces that Jessica clearly wasn't wearing for my benefit. Emma had photographed the items along with the hotel reservation confirmation that showed Jessica had booked a suite for 2 people, despite claiming she was traveling alone for client meetings. As I stood in the groom's preparation room at Hillside Manor, adjusting my tie and checking my appearance one final time, I felt a strange sense of peace about what was about to happen. Tyler was bustling around, making jokes about wedding day nerves and offering me whiskey to calm my supposedly frayed nerves. He had no idea that in 2 hours his best man would be exposing his bride's infidelity in front of 300 guests and proposing marriage to her sister instead. The ceremony location was perfect for what I had planned. The ballroom had excellent acoustics, ensuring that everyone would hear clearly when I began speaking. The photographer and videographer Jessica had hired would capture everything, creating a permanent record of her humiliation. Most importantly, the layout of the venue meant that once the revelation began, Jessica would have no easy way to escape without pushing through the crowd of shocked guests. Emma had texted me 20 minutes earlier to confirm that everything was in place on her end. Jessica was in her bridal suite, making final adjustments to her appearance and practicing her vows one last time. According to Emma, Jessica seemed genuinely excited about the ceremony, apparently convinced that she could maintain her affair indefinitely while enjoying the social status and financial security of marriage to me. Her confidence made what was about to happen even more satisfying. The processional music began, and I took my position at the altar next to Father Martinez, who had known Jessica's family for years and was genuinely excited to perform our ceremony. Tyler stood beside me as my best man, checking his pocket to ensure he had the ring that Jessica would never get to wear. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. Everyone in that ballroom believed they were about to witness the beginning of a beautiful marriage, when they were actually about to see the spectacular end of a relationship built entirely on lies. The guests rose as the bridal party began their entrance. Emma appeared first, looking stunning in the deep purple dress Jessica had chosen for her bridesmaids. But as Emma walked down the aisle, she wasn't looking at the altar or smiling for the cameras like the other bridesmaids. Instead, her eyes found mine, and in that moment of connection, I saw the same mixture of nervousness and determination that I was feeling. Jessica's other bridesmaids followed Emma down the aisle, all of them glowing with excitement about participating in what they believed was going to be a fairy tale wedding. Behind them came Jessica's flower girl niece, scattering rose petals with the kind of innocent joy that made me feel momentarily guilty about what was going to happen. But then I remembered the months of lies and betrayal, the way Jessica had looked me in the eye and made promises she had no intention of keeping, and my resolve strengthened. The music shifted to the traditional wedding march, and Jessica appeared at the back of the ballroom on her father's arm. She looked absolutely radiant in her custom designer gown, every detail perfect from her professionally styled hair to her flawless makeup. The guests gasped with appreciation at her beauty, and I heard several people whisper comments about what a lucky man I was to be marrying someone so stunning. If they only knew, I thought, as Jessica began her walk down the aisle toward what she believed was going to be the triumph of her carefully orchestrated double life. In her mind, she was pulling off the perfect deception, maintaining her affair with David while securing her future with me, getting the best of both worlds without having to choose between them. As Jessica approached the altar, her eyes met mine, and she gave me the same radiant smile that had made me fall in love with her 3 years earlier. For a split second, I almost wavered in my resolve. This was the woman I'd planned to spend my life with. The person I'd shared my dreams and fears with. The face I'd imagined growing old alongside. But then I remembered David Park's hands on her body and the lies she'd told me just that morning. About how much she loved me, and I knew there was no going back. Carlos Rodriguez placed Jessica's hand in mine with a traditional blessing about treating his daughter with honor and respect. The irony was almost too much to bear, considering that his daughter had been dishonoring our relationship for months. Father Martinez began the opening remarks about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of truth and fidelity between spouses. Words that would take on devastating significance in just a few minutes. Jessica squeezed my hand and whispered that she loved me, her performance so convincing that I almost believed she meant it. But I could see Emma watching from the side, her face pale with anticipation. And I knew that the moment of truth had finally arrived. Jessica was about to discover that the quiet, trusting man she'd been manipulating was capable of strategic thinking that would destroy everything she'd worked to build. The time for deception was over, and the reckoning was about to begin. Father Martinez opened his ceremonial book and began the traditional wedding invocation, his voice carrying across the ballroom filled with expectant guests. Jessica stood beside me, radiating confidence, completely unaware that her world was about to implode in the most public way possible. She'd squeezed my hand again during the opening prayer, and I could feel the slight tremor of excitement running through her fingers as she anticipated becoming Mrs. Thompson while maintaining her secret relationship with David Park. The priest moved through the preliminary remarks about the sacred nature of marriage, speaking about honesty, faithfulness, and the importance of building a life together on a foundation of trust. Each word seemed to amplify the magnitude of Jessica's deception, and I noticed Emma shifting uncomfortably in her position as maid of honor, knowing what was coming but still dreading the explosion that would tear her family apart. When Father Martinez reached the section about objections to the marriage, he paused and looked out at the assembled guests with the traditional words, "If anyone present knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever. Hold your peace." The ballroom fell silent except for the soft classical music playing in the background, and Jessica's smile widened as she anticipated moving past this formality toward the exchange of vows. That's when I stepped forward slightly and cleared my throat. "Actually, Father Martinez, I have something to say." The priest looked confused, clearly not expecting the groom to be the one raising an objection. Jessica's face showed a flicker of concern, but she was still smiling, probably assuming I was about to make some romantic gesture or share a personal story about our relationship. The guests murmured with curiosity, thinking they were about to witness an unconventional but charming moment. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone, holding it up so the screen was visible to Jessica and the front rows of guests. "Jessica, before we exchange vows, I think everyone here should know about your relationship with David Park." The effect was immediate and devastating. Jessica's face went completely white, and she took a step backward as if I'd physically struck her. The smile disappeared from her lips, replaced by an expression of pure panic as she realized her carefully constructed lies were about to crumble in front of everyone she knew. The murmur from the guests grew louder as people tried to process what they'd just heard. "Michael, what are you talking about?" Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper, but the excellent acoustics in the ballroom carried her words to every corner of the room. She was trying to maintain her composure, probably hoping she could bluff her way through whatever I thought I knew. I swiped to the first photograph on my phone and held it up for everyone to see. It showed Jessica and David embracing outside the Four Seasons Hotel, their body language making it unmistakably clear that this was not a professional relationship. "This was taken 3 weeks ago, during your supposed business trip to Dallas. The same trip where you told me you were working late every night to secure a major contract." Jessica reached for my phone, probably hoping to grab it and somehow prevent the rest of the evidence from being revealed. But I stepped back, keeping the device out of her reach while advancing to the next photograph. This one showed Jessica and David sharing an intimate dinner at an upscale restaurant, her hands intertwined across the table in a gesture that spoke of romantic involvement rather than business partnership. Stop this, Michael. You're embarrassing yourself and ruining our wedding day over some misunderstanding. Jessica's voice was getting stronger as her initial shock gave way to defensive anger. She was still trying to control the narrative, probably hoping she could convince the guests that I was having some kind of breakdown and misinterpreting innocent professional interactions. The guests were no longer murmuring quietly. People were standing up to get a better view of what was happening. I could hear shocked exclamations and confused questions rippling through the crowd. Carlos and Maria Rodriguez looked mortified, clearly recognizing that something terrible was unfolding, but not yet understanding the full scope of their daughter's deception. I switched to the next piece of evidence. This one a screenshot of text messages between Jessica and David. I read one of the more damaging exchanges aloud, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom sound system. From Jessica to David. Sent yesterday morning. I can't wait until this wedding charade is over and I can be with you properly. Just a few more hours of pretending to be the happy bride? The reaction from the guests was immediate and explosive. People began talking loudly to each other, some standing up and pointing, others covering their mouths in shock. I heard Jessica's aunt gasp audibly from the third row, and several of my coworkers were shaking their heads in disbelief. The photographer and videographer, following their professional instincts, continued documenting everything despite the chaos unfolding before them. Jessica abandoned any pretense of innocence and lunged for my phone again, desperation making her movements clumsy and aggressive. Give me that. You have no right to air our private business in front of everyone. Her mask had completely slipped, revealing the calculating, manipulative person she'd hidden beneath her perfect exterior. Emma stepped forward from her position with the other bridesmaids, her face pale but determined. Jessica, everyone deserves to know the truth. Michael isn't the one who should be embarrassed here. Her voice was quiet but carried clearly in the stunned silence that followed Jessica's outburst. You knew about this? Jessica whirled to face her sister, her expression shifting from panic to rage. How could you betray your own family? How could you side with him against me? Emma's response was steady and brave, despite the tears beginning to form in her eyes. I tried to get you to end the affair months ago. I begged you to either choose David or choose Michael, but you insisted on lying to everyone. You made this choice, not me. The revelation that Emma had known about the affair sent another shockwave through the assembled guests. Jessica's parents looked devastated, clearly realizing that their family had been harboring this secret while they'd been planning and paying for a wedding based on lies. Tyler, standing beside me as best man, was staring at Jessica with an expression of complete disgust, finally understanding why I'd been so distant and stressed in recent weeks. Father Martinez, clearly out of his depth in dealing with this kind of wedding day drama, attempted to restore some order to the proceedings. Perhaps we should pause the ceremony and allow the families to discuss this matter privately, he suggested, his voice uncertain as he tried to navigate unprecedented territory. No, I said firmly, addressing both the priest and the crowd of guests. Everyone here deserves to know exactly who they were about to watch me marry. I advanced to the next piece of evidence, a recording I'd made of Jessica's phone conversation with David just 2 days earlier. I played the audio through my phone's speaker, and Jessica's voice filled the ballroom as she told David about her wedding day plans. The ceremony is just a formality to keep up appearances. Once we're married, it'll actually be easier for us to meet because Michael will stop being so suspicious about my travel schedule. He's so trusting and naive, he'll probably never figure out what's really going on. The recording continued with Jessica and David making plans for a romantic getaway the week after my honeymoon, discussing how they would maintain their relationship. While I remained oblivious to their deception, Jessica's voice was filled with excitement as she described the elaborate lies she planned to tell me. And David's laughter in response made it clear that they both viewed me as nothing more than a convenient fool to be manipulated. The reaction from the guests was immediate and overwhelming. Several people began shouting questions and accusations at Jessica, while others stood up and started moving toward the exits, clearly uncomfortable witnessing such a public humiliation. Jessica's bridesmaids, who had been her closest friends, and supporters were backing away from her with expressions of shock and disgust. Carlos Rodriguez broke through the crowd and approached the altar, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Jessica Alina Rodriguez, is this true? Have you been carrying on with another man while planning to marry Michael?" His voice carried the authority of a father demanding honesty from his child, but also the pain of someone who was beginning to understand how completely he'd been deceived. Jessica looked around the ballroom desperately, probably searching for any ally or escape route that might help her salvage the situation. But every face she saw reflected disappointment, anger, or disgust. Even her closest friends were staring at her with expressions that made it clear their relationships would never recover from this revelation. "This is all being taken out of context," Jessica said, her voice cracking as she made one final attempt to control the narrative. "David and I have a professional relationship that Michael is misinterpreting because he's jealous and insecure. He's sabotaging our wedding because he can't handle my success." Emma stepped closer to her sister, her voice carrying a strength I'd never heard from her before. "Stop lying, Jessica. Everyone can see the evidence. Everyone can hear your own words. You've been caught, and continuing to lie is only making this worse." The confrontation between the sisters created a powerful visual contrast that wasn't lost on the assembled guests. Emma, in her simple purple bridesmaid dress, represented honesty and courage, while Jessica, despite her elaborate wedding gown and professional makeup, looked desperate and dishonest. The symbolism was so clear that even guests who hadn't heard all the evidence could see which sister deserved their respect and support. Tyler moved closer to me, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "Mike, what do you want to do now? Do you want to get out of here?" Was offering me an escape route, probably assuming that I'd want to leave immediately and deal with the aftermath privately, but I wasn't finished yet. The most important part of my plan was still to come. I needed Jessica to understand that her betrayal hadn't just ended our relationship. It had opened the door to something better and more genuine than what we'd ever shared together. I turned away from Jessica's desperate attempts at damage control and faced Emma directly, my voice carrying across the stunned ballroom with absolute clarity. "Emma Rodriguez, will you marry me instead?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap, creating a moment of absolute silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. Every person in that ballroom was processing what they'd just witnessed. Not only the spectacular exposure of Jessica's betrayal, but now the most unexpected marriage proposal in Austin wedding history. Emma's eyes widened with surprise, but I could see something deeper there, a mixture of hope and fear that told me everything I needed to know about her answer. "Michael, yes," Emma whispered, and then louder, so everyone could hear. "Yes, I will marry you." The ballroom erupted in chaos. Half the guests were applauding what they saw as the most romantic gesture imaginable, while others seemed scandalized. By the speed of events, Jessica let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a sob, finally realizing that she hadn't just lost her secret affair, she'd lost everything, including her family's respect and her sister's loyalty. Father Martinez looked completely bewildered, clearly never having encountered anything remotely similar in his decades of performing wedding ceremonies. "I'm not sure this is procedurally possible," he began, but Carlos Rodriguez stepped forward with surprising authority. "Father, if my daughter Emma wishes to marry Michael and he wishes to marry her, then perform the ceremony. Jessica has forfeited any claim to this wedding through her own actions." Carlos's voice carried the weight of paternal disappointment and anger, but also a recognition that Emma deserved happiness with someone who would treat her with honesty and respect. Maria Rodriguez was crying openly, but they weren't tears of sadness. She approached Emma and took her hands, speaking in rapid Spanish that I couldn't fully understand, but that clearly conveyed maternal blessing and support. Then she turned to me with an expression of gratitude that made my chest tight with emotion. "Michael, you are a good man, and Emma is a good woman. If you want to marry my daughter, you have my blessing," Maria said, her accent thick with emotion, but her words clear and decisive. Jessica made one final desperate attempt to reclaim control of the situation. "This is insane. You can't just marry my sister at my wedding. This is my day, my venue, my dress." She gestured wildly at the elaborate decorations and expensive arrangements that had been planned around her vision of the perfect wedding. Emma stepped closer to Jessica, her voice gentle but firm. "This was never really your wedding, Jessica. It was a performance you were putting on while planning to betray Michael immediately afterward. You don't get to be outraged about losing something you never actually wanted." The truth of Emma's words seemed to hit Jessica like a physical blow. She looked around the ballroom one more time, seeing the faces of friends and family members, who were no longer looking at her with admiration or envy, but with disappointment and disgust. Her perfect image was destroyed beyond repair. Everyone who mattered in her life now knew exactly who she really was beneath the polished exterior. Tyler stepped forward and removed the wedding rings from his pocket, offering them to me with a grin that suggested he was starting to enjoy the unprecedented drama. "Well, if we're doing this, we might as well do it right," he said, and I could hear the approval in his voice. He'd always liked Emma during family gatherings, often commenting that she seemed more genuine and interesting than Jessica. Father Martinez, apparently deciding that facilitating true love was more important than procedural orthodoxy, cleared his throat and addressed the assembled guests. "If everyone would please take their seats, we'll proceed with the wedding of Michael Thompson and Emma Rodriguez." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of surreal joy and satisfaction. Emma and I exchanged vows that we wrote on the spot, speaking from our hearts about honesty, respect, and building a relationship based on genuine affection rather than manipulation and lies. When I slipped the wedding ring onto Emma's finger, the same ring that had been intended for Jessica, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Emma's impromptu vows brought tears to the eyes of guests who had initially been shocked by the sudden change in proceedings. She spoke about waiting years for someone to see her true value, about learning the difference between love and performance, and about choosing courage over convenience. Her words were simple and heartfelt, completely different from the elaborate, rehearsed vows that Jessica had been planning to deliver. When Father Martinez pronounced us husband and wife, the ballroom erupted in genuine celebration. The guests who had initially been scandalized by the dramatic turn of events were now cheering and applauding, what they recognized as a much more authentic love story than the carefully orchestrated deception they'd almost witnessed. Jessica had disappeared at some point during the ceremony, probably unable to watch her sister receive the happiness and respect that she'd thrown away through her own choices. Several of her bridesmaids had followed her out, but whether to offer support or express their own disappointment, I couldn't tell. During the reception that followed, I learned that Emma had been in love with me for years, admiring my kindness and integrity while watching Jessica take those qualities for granted. She'd never acted on her feelings out of loyalty to her sister, but Jessica's betrayal had freed her to pursue happiness without guilt or family obligations. The guests who remained for the reception seemed genuinely delighted by the unexpected outcome. Many of them approached us throughout the evening too, expressed their admiration for Emma's courage and my decisive handling of Jessica's deception. Several of Jessica's own friends admitted they'd always felt something was off about her behavior but hadn't been able to identify what was bothering them. Carlos and Maria Rodriguez embraced their new son-in-law with warmth that felt completely genuine, expressing relief that their family would be connected to someone who valued honesty and commitment. Maria pulled me aside during the reception to tell me that she'd always worried about Jessica's capacity for selfishness, but she'd never imagined her daughter would be capable of such systematic deception. As Emma and I shared our first dance, as husband and wife, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. 6 months earlier, I'd thought I was living a perfect life with a woman who loved me. The discovery of Jessica's betrayal had initially felt like the end of my world, but it had actually been the beginning of something much better and more genuine. Emma looked up at me during our dance, her eyes bright with happiness and possibility. "Do you think we'll be happy together?" she asked, and I could hear both hope and vulnerability in her voice. "I think we'll be honest with each other," I replied, "and that's the foundation for everything else." The wedding that had started as Jessica's elaborate deception had become Emma's, and my celebration of authentic love and second chances. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't getting even, it's discovering that what you thought you'd lost was never actually worth having. and that something much better was waiting for you all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.